we're not talking about just who I am in this lifetime, what my name is. Anybody can say that. I've lived in certain places, I've done certain things, this is what I like to do, these are my favorite breakfast foods. This is my husband, these are my children, this is my ex-husband, these are somebody else's children. I mean, we have all these pictures that are all just based on, if you think about it, interestingly, the body that you're in. Because the body you're in just circumscribes us, right? It had a birth, it will have a death, it has certain biological connections, it has certain talents and education and history, and that just draws a circle around us. Different countries, different languages, all of that. And that is a self that's not unimportant. That's the self, but that's the self with the small s. Then there's the question about, how did I end up here? Why was I born in that place? Why am I having these inclinations? Why do I have often these nameless, unidentifiable fears and anxieties and habits and compulsions to keep my toothbrush on one side of the sink, or something like that? All of these different forces that we can tell, even with the greatest analysis or self-introspection, seem to have a power greater than we can define just by the little small identification of the small self. So the fundamental principle of self-realization is that there's another bigger thread running through our consciousness, running through our identity, that doesn't make this one non-existent or unimportant. It's just seen in a greater context. When we're talking self, we're always anxious, aren't we? Because a big part of us is not stupid, and it recognizes our own personal limitations, which we're always watching ourselves push on both sides of the door and wonder why the door doesn't open. We're always watching ourselves go only halfway, or all of the, what I'm going to explain, all of the conditioning from the past that pushes against us, anxiety about the future, all of it. So when we're just relying on the self, we have very good reason to be afraid. And that's the starting point of understanding courage, which is, as long as you imagine that you're going to summon up enough courage just out of self-affirmation, it will never work. Just as simple as that. It will never work. And if you keep trying to do something that's doomed to failure, you should not be surprised when it keeps failing. Now, I'm saying this all to you very strongly because you've come into my house here. You're sitting in the Ananda temple, and we're in front of the masters, and we pray to the masters before we start. So this is what you will hear when you come here. This is not for people who are still imagining they can make it work without divine assistance. And it's a definite stage in personal evolution, and the mere first step on that path is not the last step on that path. But there is a line in the sand where, at least, as several of you have mentioned, the possibility occurs to you that I need to think about this very, very differently. And then even once you start thinking about it differently, that's where you come to, well, then what happens? So that's exactly where we are. Many years ago, in fact, many years ago, 1989, when there was a big earthquake here in this area, I was having my teeny-weeny career as a corporate trainer, which was like, it lasted about like a champagne bubble, like that, because it was really not my story. But I had this tiny little moment because I had an HR director who knew who I was and wanted my energy in her company. But in the corporate world, you can't talk about God. You can only talk about ego and its many manifestations. You can slide in the word energy every once in a while, but it's a whole world unto itself, because everybody has different beliefs, and it goes on and on. But the earthquake happened in the middle of the time, my little teeny career, and the wife of one of the employees was crushed on the Bay Bridge and died, that was a very, very, very bad thing. I mean, not that many people died, but one of them was the wife of an employee there. So everybody in the company was completely agitated. So she called me and she wanted me to come in, and she wanted me to comfort them. And I thought about it seriously, and I said, I don't know how to comfort them without referencing a greater reality than just the ego. I said, they need faith in something. Can't you just tell them, she said, to believe in themselves? I said, well, that didn't really work very well when the Bay Bridge collapsed, did it? You know, you can believe in yourself all you want, but when that bridge was about to come down, you didn't have the power to stop it, did you? And so I just said, I'm sorry, I can't do it. There's just no way I can with sincerity, because you have to put your faith in something that actually has the power to give back to you. And so there's a point, which some of you are describing, where you realize you're up against the limits of just having faith in yourself, because you see that life is bigger than you. So many things happen at this point. Many people at this point become cynical and afraid, and they basically begin to try to reduce their life down to what they themselves can control. And this is how people become old, but you don't have to be chronologically old to do this. Children will do this. They will just risk nothing, stand within the tiny boundaries, whatever they might be, that they can see, and reject anything that threatens that little circle. And people do that for incarnations, actually. And you're still on the path to self-realization. You're just not moving very fast. You're seeing how well that works. Because the problem is, we are more than just the self that we know. We are literally that infinite self, and that infinite self is always pushing. It's very much like I have 3 houseplants. I'm not really much of a gardener. I have 3 houseplants, and I repotted all of them recently because I discovered in my own storage shed these 3 beautiful blue pots, and I looked at my poor plants, all of whom were trapped in very little houses, and I decided to put them all into these big pots. But one of them in particular, I moved him from a pot that's that big into a pot that's that big, which you're really not supposed to do, except that poor guy just goes in these little roots like this. He actually fits in this big pot. He looks in proportion, so the poor guy has just been absolutely crunched up, just growing against this. But he's trying. He was trying to grow that whole time. I just wasn't supporting him very much in what he was trying to do, because it's the nature of every living thing. It keeps wanting to expand, doesn't it? And that's what we feel within us. We want to expand into greater happiness. I mean, a number of you have said, I'm not as happy as I want to be. That's, in essence, what you've described. There's a sense that we all have, that the small s self has, that knows that there's a greater self to experience. And even if everything looks fine, we still feel unhappy. I grew up that way. I was a perfectly cheerful person, and I've never been afflicted in external ways in my life. Everything was just fine, except it was all awful. It was just all awful because I felt like I was in a straitjacket and I just didn't know where I was supposed to go. There was something inside of me that was just pushing, and I couldn't find the door. That's why I came on the spiritual path young, and I took to it immediately and never looked back, because I was that little root-bound plant. But once we have that whole big pot, we also have to start having the courage to spread out into it. So that's the dilemma that we're facing. We reach the limits, and nobody comes in this door more than once who doesn't want at least some of that. But then, of course, what we meet is all the comfort of knowing where the edges are. I don't understand plants really well, but I was talking to this little guy whose roots were all wrapped around themselves, knowing that he was going into a really big pot and hoping that it wouldn't freak him out too much. So we sort of talked about it. Don't worry, there's lots of room. I'll feed you. You'll be okay. You don't have to spread out all at once, just like that. But what happens to us is one part of us really wants to spread out, but we also have, and now this is where past lives come into it, we also have a great deal that's influencing us that we are completely affected by, that we feel, but we can't necessarily identify. And so what happens to us is we, in very simple words, we don't know what's actually causing our fear, our pain, and our stress. And we tend to, something happens outside of us, it provokes in us an extremely real response. I mean, the response that we have is not our imagination. So we think that what just happened caused this response. In other words, we don't know what the source of our suffering is. I mean, there's a metaphysical answer to that, which is even bigger, but we don't even know in the simplest cause and effect relationship what's causing this. Several of you have mentioned difficulties with other people or disharmony in your own family. Disharmony within a family, within a couple, it's, I mean, oftentimes there are real issues that have to be resolved. But a great deal of the time, it's that neither one knows where the suffering is really coming from. You do this, I'm in pain. I do this, you're in pain. Obviously, you are the problem. Obviously, what you're doing caused me to feel this way. When in fact, we are actors on a stage who have a whole huge history. Just think about all the traumas, some of which you have been subjected to perhaps in this lifetime. But think of all the traumas that are possible for people to go through. And nowadays, the way newspapers and internet work, we hear about a lot of them, don't we? We just hear about very difficult things that can happen. Maybe our drama hasn't been being boys, soldiers in African revolutions, but still, children being murdered, people going bankrupt, somebody that you love turning out to not be what you thought they were. And those situations never resolving. Imagine the things you may have been through. Because this journey of self-realization, it's self-evident if you look around, that it's going to take us more than the span of this one lifetime to finish, isn't it? I mean, we know what self-realization looks like from the pictures and the example of Yogananda and of Swami Kriyananda and other great souls, Jyotish and Devi and others that we know. And we can compare that to where we're standing, and we can, it's not that there's no hope for us, but we can see there's a distance that has to be traveled. And even the most optimistic picture tells us that, thank God, we have more time than between now and the time that we vacate this particular body. But that means that we've been through a lot of cycles before. And because one lifetime is arbitrary, you know, I know because I know your personal history, some of you have been divorced, some of you had difficulties in various ways. I'm speaking of my own life. By no means is every situation I've ever been in resolved. They've ended, but that doesn't mean they've resolved. I remember saying to Swamiji once, I just don't think I can make this one, I can do anything with this one now. He said, no, put it on the shelf for another lifetime, is what he said. He said, you'll just circle around and develop over here, and then you can come back to it. I remember a woman came to me once who was just in the throes of one of those really chaotic, operatic kind of romantic tragedies. And she sat down. I'd never met her before. I would like to finish all this karma in this lifetime, she said. I said, you better find another counselor. I can't possibly get you to finish all this because I just don't think you're capable of finishing it. You can progress it, but you can't finish it. It's just too much. You can just progress it. So that's what we're always doing. And that's the first and most important thing for us to realize. We're not going to finish it. We're just progressing it. And we have to have the courage to progress it rather than putting our heads in the sand and hoping it would just be finished and go away. So whenever we're acting in this world, we are in the middle of a much longer story. And even that simple thought, at least I've certainly found it for myself, even that simple thought helps me so much in knowing what to do and how to do it. No failure is permanent, And success is not going to just be like that. Oh, I'm going to finish this karma. Oh yeah, now I'm finished with this karma. Not likely. But I can progress it, because everything that I progress, everything gets better if I can progress it. And so that makes me realistic in my choices. It makes me practical in my idealism. And when we become practical in our idealism, we know what to do. And a lot of the times, what we don't have the courage for is some impractical, insane idea, but we have lots of courage for a very practical idea. This is within the scope of my actual capabilities, and this is a realistic expectation of what's going to happen. And then we find, oddly, that we zip along in our progress because we take a whole lot of small steps instead of sitting there or trying to take some gigantic step, from which we practice what I call boing back yoga. Boing back is, I used to have as a child, they must still have them, I hope, those little rubber stringy things with a ball on the end, and you have this paddle thing, and so you could whack it way out, but it would always boing back, right? And so a lot of times people practice boing back yoga, which is they give themselves a huge whack, send themselves way out farther than they have any foundation to stand on, and feel like they're really sailing along, and then it boings back. Far better to just take a whole lot of small steps, because there won't be a reaction to that. Practical in your idealism. Some of you have heard this before, but it's absolutely the key to courage, confidence, and calmness. And it is that there are basically 3 dimensions to our awareness. We're simultaneously acting and being conscious of ourselves on 3 simultaneous levels. When I say conscious, I don't mean necessarily that we can conjure it up and know, but it's influencing us. And it's very simple. And I'm going to use the word subconscious here. Those of you who have the word subconscious in a psychological sense, there's a certain overlap, but not completely. The second level, what we call, is conscious. And the third level is superconscious. Now, what this little trio does for us is it gives us a way of understanding what's influencing us and how to respond to those influences. We tend to think of this, okay, let me just try to think about it. Subconscious is everything that's already happened. So it's very much, I use a computer, I've used computers for years. I don't understand them or program them or anything like that. So I have often imagined that my computer had an opinion, and that often its opinion was that it was out to get me. That for some reason it had taken an irrational dislike to me and was therefore thwarting my every effort to get the work done. The people who understand computers explain to me that a computer is an inert object, and it merely responds according to how it's been programmed. And it's just completely neutral. It just gives back what was given to it. Garbage in, you get garbage out. That's the phrase that people use. I don't know if that still applies to technology as it is today, but that was it. Your subconscious self is everything that you've ever done before. Now, factoring in reincarnation, this also includes every time your individual awareness, and the actual word for it, which I will start using, is the word jiva. Jiva roughly translates to the word soul in English, but jiva is a more subtle idea and more exact. Jiva is the unique spark of your individuality. I can give you the words about how your individuality came about, but I don't really understand it in a cosmic sense. The infinite conceived of the idea of your individuality, and from that thought, you were manifested. But from the beginning, the masters say, individuality, your individuality has always been there. So this recognizable spark, which is now operating with your name on it, is the jiva, and every incarnation that you have ever had or ever will have, that bubble will always be there, that unique bubble. When you merge into the infinite sea, the bubble, your jiva, will still be in the sea. It will have merged with all of them, but still, the sea is composed of countless examples. So the jiva, that's you. Everything that ever happened to your unit of consciousness in all of your previous incarnations remains with you as a subconscious impression. The mechanism of how those impressions are carried from life to life is through the chakras. The chakras represent the spectrum of reality, from complete belief that the material world is the only reality that there is, that you're born, you die, and that's it, to the understanding that everything is part of infinity, and so am I. And every time you do anything in your life, you're affirming somewhere on that spectrum. In our lives from day to day, we're often caught. Do we actually feel that God has his arms around us and will take us where we need to be? Or do we cling to the dead body of whatever, afraid that there's nobody to take us where we need to go next? These are different concepts of reality. When a person becomes angry at someone and decides that I know what the solution is, and they pull out a gun and they shoot the person, they murder them. You know, your wife has a lover and you discover them together, and then you shoot the lover and you think this is going to solve the problem. This is a certain concept of reality, isn't it? That the problem is that other man. So I'll just kill him and then everything will be fine. Of course, it doesn't take into account a whole lot of other things like going to jail for the rest of your life and stuff like that. But in the moment, you're the problem, I'll get rid of you. It's a certain level of reality, isn't it? When somebody says something unkind to you and you try to get back at them because you're the problem. I mean, that's a certain level of reality, isn't it? When somebody's unkind to you and your thought is, you must be so unhappy to have said such an unkind thing. What can I do to help you? That's a different level of reality, isn't it? And so every thought, every action, every attitude, every response that we ever have, ever, happens as a certain affirmation of a certain vibration of reality somewhere between absolute materialism and divine freedom. And that's represented in the chakras. And so every action is a vibration of energy, and that vibration of energy is stored in the chakra that vibrates appropriately. Now, the whole subject of the chakras is more complicated than that, but for this purposes of this discussion, this works. This is the means, because the chakras are not physical. The chakras are a vibration of energy. And when our physical body dies, our energy goes on. The pattern of energy that is you, which is really what animates your physical body and makes you different, gives the sound of your voice, your taste, your preferences, the way your face looks, your eyes, everything. It's all that energy flowing through, which is why the moment the jiva exits a physical body, the physical body is like nothing. It's like a chair, like a sweater at that point. There's just nothing. It looks like you, but not really, because what made it look like you was the energy that was manifesting through it. Take the energy away and it ceases to be you. People who have death and return experiences often talk about how one of the most confusing parts is looking at their own bodies and just seeing their bodies without any animating energy, and how confusing it is. One of the more interesting death and return stories, it used to be called Return from Tomorrow. It has another name now, by a man named Dr. Ritchie. And he died when he was in the influenza epidemic in the Second World War, when he was stationed at a huge army base somewhere in Texas. And he was in a bed with hundreds and hundreds of other beds in this huge army infirmary of some sort. And he left his body because he died, and he went off and had this great experience, which is fascinating, but not the point here. But then when he was sent back to his body, he couldn't figure out which one was his. He got lost in the buildings, and then even then, he couldn't figure out which one was his because it was inert. And he finally saw a ring that he recognized, literally, and he realized that must be my body. And he went back into it at that point. I mean, I just love that. Just to be so far out of it and have it just be like nothing, He couldn't figure out which one to get back in until there was some tangible recollection. So all of our past experiences register in the chakras when we take off the clothing of this particular costume, of this particular show. When the show is over and we strike the set and this world disappears, what goes, though, is the energy pattern that's really made us who we are. All the unresolved longings and regrets. Those are the two words that Swami Kriyananda used, longing and regret. Very important words. What we still long for, what we regret, both of them bind us equally. And it's unresolved vibrating energy. And we take our chakras, we take our astral body, and we take it into the astral world, which we've seen enough movies now that all show us what that looks like. And we hang out there for a while, doing various things, until those longings and regrets make us so restless that we have to come back into another physical body. Just like you can stay home maybe most of Saturday, but by Saturday evening, you're a little stir crazy, aren't you? You need to see something else. You need to get a pizza. You need to go out to a movie. Usually most people, especially not in America, especially not in Silicon Valley, can't stay home for more than a day or two without this restless energy pushing them. All these longings or regrets, whatever they are, it's exactly the same in the astral world. And so we come to finish, or we come to progress it a little further, because the little self needs to understand what it really is. It needs to experience and resolve all those longings and regrets and figure out what is the enduring reality. Not just the impulse of the little one, but what is the enduring reality. And that's really what we, I, are all doing every single day, aren't we? We're trying to figure out, where does my happiness come from? What causes me suffering? What causes me happiness? And not just, ooh, look at that, ice cream, I'll eat the whole pint. And it's great while it happens, but then afterwards you feel sick. It's like somebody did something I didn't like, and I just screamed at them and shouted at them, and now they don't want to come home again. How did that work? That was about as effective as the pint of ice cream, wasn't it? It might have felt good while I was screaming, but it had consequences. What are the consequences of my actions? What actions bring me the results that I really want? This is the little self on the journey of the jiva, trying to find out what is lastingly true. Now, all of us have this pattern in our chakras, unless you're a self-realized master in which all longings and regrets have been resolved, and there are none. All the rest of us are compelled by these past experiences to take a body. And the pattern in your chakras is what causes you to choose a country, a set of parents, an economic circumstance, to be born to friends or enemies. A lot of times you're born to enemies as likely as you are born to friends, or your sisters or your brothers or your Uncle Mort or somebody in there, your grandpa. He might be a friend, he might be an enemy. Because longings and regrets, longing for vengeance, for example, longing for the chance to get back at him on the child's part. Somebody did something to me and I'm so mad at him. Let's say your mother was your sister in a previous lifetime and she stole your inheritance, and you're just obsessed with her and you just can't wait to make her life miserable. So good, you get to be her baby. And you start with colic, right? And then it just goes on from there, doesn't it? Right? It's not a very elevated idea, but you can see how it would happen. One of the death and return stories that I remember was about a Nazi and his victim. And the victim was really attached to the Nazi because the victim was so consumed with hatred, she could not let go of him. So it was going to bring her back to him again and again. You would think the last thing you would want to see would be that. But she regretted not being able to make him suffer the way she suffered. So she comes to make him suffer. It's not a very elevated point of view, but there it is. Think about it. You killed my daughter, I'm going to kill you. The Master said, hatred draws you as much as love. And a lot of families, he said, They're born together so that they can just fight it out at close quarters. It's very, God sees it in a very neutral way. See, we think everything is designed for pleasure. We want it to be easy and pleasurable. Think about it. That's really our top value, isn't it? We want it to be easy and we want it to be pleasurable. Now think about it as the parent of a child. If your concept of raising your child is that you want it to be easy and pleasurable for your child, you'll get to still have that child at home when he's 45, won't you? Just sitting there letting you do his laundry because you decided that easy and pleasurable was your value. No, an ideal parent wants to raise the child to be strong and capable. And you have to do that with wisdom, but you want to do that in such a way because that's the real goal, isn't it? We always talk about Heavenly Father and Divine Mother. Why do we have those images? Because we're trying to get us to understand we are being raised by divine parents, and they're not really concerned about how easy and pleasurable it is for us because we're children and they want us to become grown-ups. The reason I spent so much time establishing this, and maybe this is I'm just giving you what has worked for me, which is I have learned to be extremely suspicious of my own reasoning in the moment, especially when that reasoning has an urgency about it. Okay? Because whenever there's an urgency that this has to be said, this has to be done, I can't stand it another minute, the likelihood that you're actually centered in the truth diminishes in exact proportion to how urgent that feeling is. Because generally speaking, when you're feeling really urgent about something, you have moved out of, everything has become desperate in this moment. We're not thinking about long rhythms. We're not able to actually appraise because the feeling you're having is real. This is the point that's important. The feeling you're having is real. You are having it. The question is, what's causing it? Because what's causing it needs to dictate our response. Because, yes?
Can it be the ego wanting to control?
The ego wanting to control is one of those things that makes it urgent. Is because the ego, the small self, suddenly feels intensely threatened. It believes that what's actually threatening it is some external cause. And if I can just shoot, my wife's lover, then I won't suffer anymore. I mean, I'm using that as an example because most of us probably wouldn't do that anymore, right? But all of us probably have done that in some lifetime. It epitomizes, if I can get rid of something outside myself, I'll be better inside myself. And this is the difference between responding to a situation, which is a very helpful thing to do, and reacting to a situation. Okay? If you can get those two words in your mind. To respond is appropriate and necessary. To react, by its very definition, takes away that moment of calm consideration. I feel threatened, I'm going to neutralize the threat. And if that threat happens to look like you, then I'm just going to neutralize you as a threat. By words, by physical action, by gunfire, whatever it might be. To respond is to pause for that moment and ask myself, where is this coming from? I mean, yes, I'm having a true feeling that makes me feel that these circumstances or this person is threatening me, threatening my well-being, my happiness, even my survival. But is that really the source? I mean, to use Atmajyoti's ridiculous example, what would happen if I moved the toothbrush? Really, what would happen? Would I really actually lose control of my life on the level of magnitude that I'm reacting to? Yeah, what would happen? And therefore, depending on what would really happen, I can gauge my response. It's easy. I know I can just respond to this. I can move the toothbrush and just watch. Nothing happens, right? But if somebody else moves the toothbrush, we just react like crazy because we have lost, your word, control. But what are we trying to control? We're trying to control a universe that can't be controlled, aren't we? And so this is where we come to the limits of the small self. We have to be working in relationship to somebody else's plan. And is there anybody else's plan? And is that plan benign or malignant? Is there a benign plan? Is there even a beneficent plan, a beneficial plan to our lives? Or is there a malignant force that at all times we must be protecting ourselves against? And if so, where does that reaction come from? Well, if I was killed in war, if I was sold into slavery, if I was terribly mistreated, somebody told me that as a child, in one lifetime, I was abandoned at the railroad station by a father who couldn't take care of me, and then I had to raise myself as a child on the street. So there's a little panic reaction there to nobody's abandoned me now, but the feeling is real because it did happen. Okay, but just to go to that lifetime, simultaneously to realizing whether it's really true or not, I don't know. When it was told to me, I had a double reaction. One was, whoa, that was a tough lifetime. And a lot of bad qualities in me came from that lifetime. Simultaneously, I thought a lot of really good qualities came to me from that lifetime. Because there really is, I believe, a beneficial plan that is trying not to make it easy and pleasurable, but to put us into a position where we can always respond in a way that moves us toward the self and away from the small self, where the jiva really can learn what it's trying to learn. What is real? Where does my happiness come from? What do I need to do to be experiencing that happiness? Do I need to control every little thing in my environment? Or can I just relax into myself and let it play itself out? What difference does it make? Now, does that make sense? So now we come to the superconscious. The subconscious is everything that's already happened. And whenever we're reacting from the subconscious, we are simply repeating what we already know. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's ugly or evil or bad or to be avoided. Subconscious habits and subconscious attitudes, some of them are really just fine. A lot of our subconscious has been well programmed. And not everything merely because it's already there is bad. Every time we do good things, we're also building subconscious conditioning that's beneficial. But merely because it feels right doesn't mean that it's taking us where we want to go. It just means that it feels familiar. And this is where the trickiness about internal, your inner voice has to be refined. It may be a strong inner voice. It just may be a very subconscious inner voice. Superconscious is the part of us that connects with the infinite. If you think of it like this, let's think of it as an inverted pyramid. And this is the jiva identified with this particular body. And ego is the jiva identified with the body. And physical body, astral, and causal. There are 3 levels, but let's just say physical body. That's what ego is. Ego is the infinite, the jiva, identified with this limited form. Therefore, ego tells us, protect the limited form at all times. Don't let anybody do anything against it, physically, mentally, emotionally, at all times. Put circle the wagons and protect yourself. Okay? Because it's got this tiny little reality and it just wants to keep it going. I am this kind of a woman, I'm this kind of a man, this is what I need. Don't touch my toothbrush. Okay? It happens, doesn't it? Yeah. Don't touch my toothbrush. Okay. But in fact, this is the tiniest manifestation of this expanding reality, which is our true self. The self is just a little tiny pinpoint of the true self. And this literally goes out to infinity. There's no boundaries to this. Everything about this is coming up from the subconscious from all the previous incarnations. But what we're really trying to do is to move into the superconscious. And superconscious is where the infinite connects with the limited. So at all times that we are being influenced by the subconscious, all our unresolved regrets, all our unresolved longings that are just trying to push us, our fears, everything that contracts us, simultaneously with actually greater force, although we're not always aware of it, we're being called to expand. Because the jiva knows that our happiness does not lie in contraction, but in expansion. And so now we get 2 more words here, which is, my pen is not working, which is expansive versus contractive. And contractive means anything that takes me back to what I've already experienced and what I already know. And expansive is anything that takes me to become bigger and more than I presently am. It might be expansive to take ballet lessons. It might be expansive to learn to play the piano. It might be expansive to not react in the same way you have always reacted, to have a new response to the same old input. That could be an expansive reaction. Now, that means that you can't always judge expansive in terms of what's nice, pleasurable, or easy. Because if, for example, you have allowed people to constantly take advantage of you because you have never had the courage to really stand up for what you know to be true, to be very cooperative and nice for you is not expansive. It's just following the same old subconscious pattern and just staying as small as possible because you're reacting to the possibility that it'll get worse if I do something different. And someone made a comment here that even though what's going on is not so terrific, we tend to prefer the known suffering to the fear of what might happen if I stepped out of what's known to me. And this is why the subconscious holds us. But simultaneously, we know that what I already know isn't enough. That's why you end up in this room. Because even though you're all people of accomplishment, education, talent, ability, nobody survives in this valley without a lot of those qualities, which is why actually I love being here. It's just a super dynamic part of the world to live in. So you have accomplished a great deal, and much that your subconscious is giving you is terrific. But somehow you know that it's not enough. The present level of whatever it is that you've accomplished feels contractive. There's got to be more, and that's what's calling you. It's your superconscious, and the superconscious never rests. And it's never going to give up, no matter how many times you tell it to shut up, no matter how many incarnations you turn your back on it. It will just keep nagging at you. Because this is our destiny. We are the river flowing to the sea. And as soon as the spring comes out of the earth, it chooses a direction, and that direction is to go to the ocean, doesn't it? All water flows toward the sea. All jivas head toward the superconscious. So at any point in our lives, we are always being pulled in 2 directions. And I'm sure you can look at your life in the largest and the smallest picture, and you'll see you're always being pulled in 2 directions. Depending how consciously you are following a path of self-realization, whatever you call it, everybody's following the path of self-realization. This is not we don't own these words. This is a definition to find out who I really am and experience it. The more consciously you're doing that, the more you're actually weighing these principles. Atma Jyoti referred to the yamas and the niyamas, which is something we study. And we say this is, truthfulness, harmlessness, covetousness of things that are not mine, devotion to God, many others that come with that. A friend of mine raised 8 children, and early on, she put the yamas and the niyamas, they're the do's and the don'ts, the things you should cultivate, the things that you should avoid. She put them on the refrigerator, as she put it, literally on the refrigerator in the household with 8 children. And whenever there was any controversy, she would bring the children in front of the refrigerator, and they would look at these qualities, and they would figure out who had violated which qualities, and that's why there was disharmony in the house. It had several things. One, it educated her children from a very young age in a very sophisticated way, brought down to child level. 2, she said, it made the refrigerator the disciplinarian in the house. Isn't that excellent? Yeah, it was never mother, it was the refrigerator. There it is, right on the refrigerator. It worked. She raised very fine children, all of them. Yeah. Okay. So now let me think where I was with this. So we're always being pulled this way. Now, I've said this is superconscious is the past, that subconscious is the past and what you've already accomplished. The superconscious is your own potential. And since your own potential is infinite, as soon as you begin to progress, whatever you progress to immediately becomes your subconscious, meaning it's what you've already accomplished. And since your superconscious potential is infinite, there's no end to this. It's just the baseline keeps going up. And what was expansive before now becomes contractive because you've already accomplished it. So if you meditate 15 minutes a day and then 15 minutes a day becomes your norm, and you can always meditate 15 minutes a day, your superconscious may be saying to you, how about half an hour, right? If you've been tithing 2% of your income and you're feeling like pretty hot stuff because you're giving 2%, suddenly 2% is contractive because how much faith do I have in God? If I'm only giving 2%, it's just become normal for me. Maybe I should give 4%. Maybe I should give 10. But if I'm keeping all my money for myself and put $1 into the basket and that's all that I ever do, maybe I should start giving 2%. You see, it all depends on where you're standing. It's because every jiva is unique and every path to self-realization is your own. So you have to figure out exactly what is it for me that is my next step forward. And you can't measure that somebody's ahead or behind. You can't really tell because a person may be extremely advanced in one way and extremely contracted in another. It's not a race. It's not like they're ahead and I'm behind. It's everybody has an edge and everybody needs to be moving through it. Now, the conscious level of awareness actually doesn't really exist as a separate reality. It is the battleground between these two forces. And isn't that what it feels like? Yeah. What we're aware of in the moment is just that we're being pulled in two directions almost all the time. And how intense that battle is basically how much we're resisting the bubbles, the river's desire to get to the sea. The more intensely we resist, the more awful the battle, isn't it? The more willing we are, the more adventurous we are, the more excited we are about expansion, the more enjoyable the whole process becomes. What happens to us, you see, is we become obsessed with each individual decision and we feel every decision is really what counts. It isn't every decision that counts. And what happens is we become obsessively afraid of making a mistake in the small field. And the criteria that we use to evaluate our decisions is too specific. And we think that this is a mistake that everyone makes. You think that God has an opinion about things like, and I'm going to say really big things, whether you get married, who you marry, whether you have children, what city you live in, what profession you follow, and whether you follow allopathic or naturopathic medicine. He doesn't have an opinion. He really doesn't, because we have so many lessons to learn, and the lessons are not about the details. The lessons are about whether or not we are moving in a superconscious or a subconscious direction. And we can take any circumstance and turn it into a subconscious experience. And we can take any circumstance and turn it into a superconscious experience. This is where early on I was saying, being practical in your idealism, it may be, oh, I want a more serviceable profession. I was born to be a healer. I'm an artist by nature. We say all these things and we become obsessed about the fact, I'm not doing my art, I'm not doing my healing, I'm not doing my music because I am a single mother and I have 3 children to support and it's absolutely out of the question. But we get in this, we think that the battleground is between whether I'm being an artist or not. But the battleground is whether or not we are cooperating and responding. Do we believe that there is a divine mother, a beneficial power watching our lives? Do we believe that circumstances in themselves are neutral and they're only positive or negative depending on whether I respond contractively or expansively to them? When other people are relying on me or there's simply no practical way for me to change circumstances at this time? Do I spend all my time filled with longing and regret over those circumstances? Or do I look at it and say, well, what expansive new thing can I do with this? To get to a more expansive outlook, it's one small step at a time. But the decisions are almost always first about consciousness, attitude, open heartedness, kindness, surrender to God, service, love, and very rarely about the circumstances in which you do those things. And so we tend to think if circumstances were different, then I would be a better person. But usually, first we should become a better person, and then our circumstances either will or won't change, but it won't matter as much. Because there's a principle of prosperity, and that's an abundance, which comes in here, which is gratitude and making full use of what's given to you is fundamental to attracting more. So in our own lives, we say, I will be a real spiritual person as soon as I have the right opportunity. Just watch how loving and selfless I'll be. But what I have right now, I'm just going to push aside and push aside and push aside. The law of prosperity doesn't work like that. But what we need to change is our inner magnetism, our gratitude, and just simply our frugality. In this sense, use what you've got. Use your circumstances. Sometimes I've had people come to me, and the bane of people's lives these days so often is relationships. So many people are either miserable because they're married or they're miserable because they're not married, but one way or another, it has to do with relationships. But a lot of times single, especially single women, but also single men, because women who are hoping to have children, they come to me and it's not a joke. It's a very deep longing and it's a serious issue. But I've suggested, what do you think will happen to you when you have that ideal relationship and those babies that you want to have? How will you behave? Who will you become? Now, a certain amount of that is dependent on that relationship and those babies, but not all of it. So make a list of everything you think those circumstances will allow you to be and start being as many of those as you can. I would have a more open home. I would host more people. I would cook more. I would have people into the house. I would be more serviceful. I would direct my finances more carefully. I would be more cheerful. I would be friendly to all the children in the neighborhood. I would take interesting trips. I would start taking college classes, whatever the list might be. Do as many of them as you can, because circumstances always look attractive to us because we imagine that our consciousness will be different if we have different circumstances. Think about it. Why do I want to change my job? Why do I want to be in silence more? Because I think if I could be like that, then something will happen that will make me happy. The whole process of self-realization, where does my happiness come from? Where does my suffering come from? And how can I make it work? Is it really circumstances? Or is it how I have allowed my circumstances to dictate my consciousness? And sometimes it is appropriate to change circumstances, but it's almost never appropriate to change circumstances if we're doing that in lieu of putting out the effort to change our consciousness in the circumstances we have. Because it's the law of abundance. Gratitude, frugality, these are important rules. So circumstances, I have to be grateful and abundant and frugal in the sense of I don't want to just waste. That's what I mean by frugal. I don't want to just waste this opportunity and just say, oh, I'm not going to learn anything here because I don't like it here. I'm going to go over there and that's what I'm going to, you watch how nice I'll be. But you won't be, because why not now? And then, of course, it may be too much for you and it may be appropriate to change. But the only way you can tell is that if you've actually done something with it. So you're sitting in your office, and that same awful person who comes up and bends your ear every single day comes up and starts doing it again. And the first thing you start thinking of is what a horrible person you are, and I wish you would shut up. Ooh, how expansive is that? Is that actually a response or is that a reaction? And how can I find something to love about this person? How can I take care of my inner world? Here I am in this god-awful boring meeting that's going to go on another hour. What can, so I think I'll just sit here and be upset the whole time. Or, gee, there's a lot of miserable people in here. Maybe I should start praying for them. Really, literally. Just while you're sitting there, just bored to tears. Just, go around the room. Visualize each person in light. Gives you something to do. A woman friend had to work in Ananda had a house in one district in San Francisco at that time, and we ran a little store for a short time in another. This woman had to work late. The store was open late, and she had to work the late shift, and she had to take a bus across town. She came to Swamiji, and she said she was afraid on that bus because it was late at night, and often it went through some parts of town that she wouldn't have gone through at that time of night. And most of the people who rode the bus were there were reasons why they were riding the bus, and they weren't always really uplifting reasons. And Swami said, "Well," and he tried to understand if there was a choice, because it's expansive to try to find a creative solution. To be expansive is not merely to endure. Sometimes to be creative is the way to be expansive, instead of, well, there's just nothing that can be done about it. This is just the way life is, and I just have to sit here. Often that's very contractive. So he made sure that there was nothing she could do about it. And then he says, well, it looks like you have to. So he said, why don't you start praying for people? And so the next time she sat on the bus, she looked at the one who scared her the most. She went to the spiritual eye. She saw the divine light there. She recognized that in superconsciousness we're all the same. And she just started visualizing this strange, fearsome person as being a child of God, surrounded by light, loved by Divine Mother, being guided on his own journey. All her fear disappeared. And she said the bus ride home late at night became her favorite part of her entire day. She just completely changed. Nothing in her circumstances changed, but she took an expansive position in regard to her circumstances. Does that make sense? And those are the small decisions you have to make. And somebody I've always I don't have it so much now, but I used to have a very strong sense of personal space, and I had a strong sense of noise. I still have a fairly strong sense of noise, but so if people came too close to me and talked too loudly, it would be very jarring to me, very upsetting to me. Even though I gradually realized nothing is happening. Somebody's just standing a little close to me and talking a little loud. But where is the suffering? This is like, where is my reaction coming from? I mean, that's why I put this up here. We inherently think that we have a reason to feel this way, but stop and ask yourself, am I really suffering? Or have circumstances veered out of my control? What do I think is going to happen if this person stands close to me and talks loudly? And I finally figured out nothing. Absolutely nothing. Eventually, everyone stops talking and goes away. If nothing else, that we will all eventually die. But it will end. That's 100% perfect. And what you have to understand is that simple practice will take you to infinity. Because you will gradually realize that absolutely nothing is affecting you. You're only reacting to it. And I mean, nothing, literally nothing. Being crucified, there's nothing to react to. Because who's being crucified? This physical body. But who am I? And that's why I spend so much time on this. Merely because you are having an actual experience doesn't mean that experience is related to what's going on around you. And therefore, no matter how much you shift what's going on around you, you will still keep reacting. Because it's starting with you. It's not restarting with them. And those are the small decisions that you have to make. When something really, really difficult happens, that is objectively where your feelings are not exaggerated, but to be very upset if your own child cuts you out of his life, you'd have to be made of stone not to feel that. So nothing in the spiritual teaching says, I can't feel this. So you have to understand, we had the word authentic, and authentic hasn't come up yet in this conversation. Swami Kriyananda, and I always use him as an example, he was very real. He never hid his responses to situations. When he was discouraged, he didn't hesitate to say so. When he was sad, he didn't hesitate to say so. When something broke his heart, he didn't hesitate to say his heart was broken. He struggled with many circumstances many times, and he set an example of authenticity. The more spiritually expanded you are, the more sensitive you are, not the opposite. You know, to be hard is a fear reaction. The first thing you have to realize in a situation where your own children are behaving in a certain way, it's a long rhythm. And perhaps it will last the whole incarnation, perhaps it'll last 6 months, perhaps it'll last a week, perhaps it'll last a decade. It's a long rhythm. The offspring is trying to find him or herself, and they're going to have to go through what they're going to have to go through, and your collateral damage. Maybe you are literally the actual target, and there's a past life story that is lodged in both your subconscious that's being acted out, maybe. Maybe the young person is just so self-involved, they have no idea what they're actually doing to you.
How do you find that out?
Well, generally speaking, if your offspring have cut you out of the picture, there's nothing you can do in regard to them at all. And so it entirely becomes a question, and this is where karma gets really, really tough. Nothing ever comes to you that isn't appropriate. And the karma that we reap in the moment is energy that we ourselves have set in motion at some previous time. That doesn't mean you've been a bad parent at this point or anything like that, but at some time you set in motion a certain kind of energy that was going to demand a certain kind of response. I mean, without being specific, maybe you've made, I know both my parents are passed now, but I know that my father and I were close. My mother and I were cordial, but my father and I were closer. But my father allowed a great deal of his happiness to depend on my actions. And at a certain point, I found that to be an intolerable burden. I mean, I'm not raised, I'm a very American person. I don't resonate with a society in which your family owns you, and your first responsibility is to your family. I don't resonate with that. That's not my karmic reality. I'm a very individualistic person, and being on the spiritual path has made me more so. I was never unkind to my parents, but I had to put out a lot of energy to protect myself against my father's dependence on me for his happiness, because I simply wasn't willing to take it on. You could say I was selfish, or he was selfish. I'm not sure which side. He was misguided. Maybe I was misguided, but I actually asked Swami Kriyananda about it. No, he said, and my father never demanded much of me. It was much more on a subtle level. But I could feel that, his dependence on me was not something I could have in my life. I just couldn't have it. I managed to make it work without having to do anything dramatic except once or twice. But still, I absolutely had to get it out of my life. Now, you would think it would be a harmless thing, but it wasn't for me. And you don't know what kind of a story your own offspring are running. And therefore, but I still worry a little that it's going to come back on me. There's certain things certain ways I responded, especially to my mother, that were just very insensitive. And I think, so when other people treat me insensitively, I just have to say, it's balancing. It's balancing. And so you have to say, and this is the great challenge of the law of karma, because if it's ever true, it is always true. And is that an easy teaching? No, that's a very difficult teaching. But if it is ever true, it is always true. If this is an interrelated universe in which cause and effect plays itself out, and we we receive what we have magnetized to ourselves, positive and negative. That means that whatever's coming to you is exactly what you need, sent to you by a divine, loving mother to teach you something you don't know. And maybe they're using the ignorant, misguided, bad karma of someone else to get you, but it still means that you need to be got. They may also be wrong, but that doesn't make you right, because this is what I need to have happen to me. I need to break my attachments. I need to see things in a broader sense. I need to become more unconditional in my loving. I need to be more sensitive in my understanding. I need to say less of, but you owe me. How dare you? All of these things, because this is the battleground, the conscious battleground. Now, in the midst of all that, you can cry your eyes out and make no bones about it. Just because if that's also true, that's also true. But once you stop weeping, you have to say, well, now what do I do? And then you have to, then when you evaluate what I do, you have to evaluate expansive, contractive, subconscious versus superconscious. Karma is always fair. I can't make them be different than they're going to be. You know, it's very hard for parents and children because there's a certain time where you have complete control over them, and they themselves have not come into their own power. So I've watched this so many times with parents. I've never raised my own children, but my, have I watched this. This is part of being in a community for 40 years. Watching parents' expectations of their children. And what amuses me, in a very bitter sort of amusement, is how many parents, many peers I have seen who have no particular relationship with their parents. They might not even like their parents, and they certainly may not be close, but they absolutely believe that their children will be close with them. And I mean, I no longer try to make that as an objective point. I just watch it. Because your child, you don't create your child's destiny. You don't create his karma. You don't create his soul. As Swami said, you create the vehicle, which is the physical body, through which your child can express his destiny, his karma, and his soul. But you don't own or create any of that. You just create a physical body. And for a long period of time, before that individual has the capacity to take care of himself, you have pretty much control over him or her. And there's a certain hiatus in that person's full expression of their nature. So I watch virtually every parent I know, with very few exceptions, decide that what they're seeing and what they're doing is the ongoing reality of that individual. And then when that individual suddenly gets the power to express themselves, sometimes they just shock the socks off of their parents. Well, you can only work with your own consciousness and the degree to which you remain allowing your happiness to be dependent on someone else's actions. To that extent, you're still in the generational pattern. Because what is dysfunction? Dysfunction is trying to make other people around you behave in a certain way so that I will feel better. And right function is when I take responsibility for my own happiness, and instead of reacting to what other people are doing, I try to respond appropriately. Now, that's the word that I haven't yet put on the board, but the word is appropriate. And appropriate is appropriate. Appropriate for the superconscious expansion of everyone involved. And maybe your children will actually turn out to be your friends. Maybe when everybody grows up, you will find that even if you weren't parent and child, you are actually friends. And maybe you will find out that you are not. Because there's no guarantee. Absolutely no guarantee. Even if you were very close when you were small, when they were small, they're not small. You know, you had control over them. You could lift them. You could take them where you wanted them to go. You could control their influences. Now they're choosing their own. Even if they're disastrous, you may still have no control. So you can cry your eyes out to the end of your days, which Mothers do. And I'm not saying they shouldn't. But you also have to respond appropriately. And if your grown or almost grown offspring has made it very clear to you what they will and will not accept, then what is the point of pounding at their door? Yeah. So you have to find peace in your own heart. Now it comes over to here too. Who is in charge? Who wrote the play? Is there anybody in charge? I don't just mean of me, but of it, of the whole story here. Is there an inherent beneficial logic, even if not discernible, that is going on in everybody's life? Is there a plan? And is that plan going to resolve in goodness? Not necessarily in this incarnation, but maybe. We can always take a longer range view. A lot that is horrible for a while turns out to be very good. My mother had Parkinson's 15 years. Parkinson's is really awful. I think it's a little less now because the drugs are a little better, but it was awful. And she, to her credit, she was gutsy. You know, she struggled and fought and used her willpower every step of the way. And after about 12 years, she said to me, we were having lunch out, I hate to admit it, she said, just like this, I loved it. I hate to admit it, but this disease has been the making of me. She was absolutely right. I mean, she's going to be an entirely different person after this incarnation because, and you know, it was her good karma. Might even have been the good karma of having raised a child who became a devotee. That instead of just having an easy, pleasurable ride to the end of her life, she had to use her willpower and her determination and her discrimination with tremendous power every single day and night. And it just turned her into somebody she wasn't. So instead of having the comfortable ride of having, you know, wonderful children always telling you how great you are, suddenly it's pulled away from you. And all of a sudden, not only do you not have the comfort of that individual, but you have their total criticism and absolute rejection of you. Now, on the surface, I think that's horrible. And it would certainly make you cry and is not like necessarily a really good idea. However, the first thing to ask is, well, what's my part in this? You know, just honestly and objectively, how much of what I'm being accused of is true? And then maybe it isn't. Maybe it's just that other person's delusion. Then, so the first thing is, well, what can I learn from this? What's objectively true here? How can I respond rather than react? I might not like being called the most horrible mother in the world, and I'm probably not. But, you know, what did I do? What am I doing? That is not appropriate. And how can I change? And then you can maybe decide that it's just all their problem. Then how do I make myself happy having lost what I considered to be the most important key to my happiness? And how wise was that? How wise was that to give birth to a child and then think that child was going to be responsible for my happiness for the rest of my life? Maybe that was not such a good idea from the beginning. You know, all of these thoughts, they have to be asked. And maybe I've just raised a selfish brute for a child, and there you have it. And either I did a bad job doing it, or that was their karma. And they're just going to have to learn the consequences of this, because they will. You don't have to punish them. They will. I mean, now you don't. They will. For example, they'll raise a child who will reject them. Oh, maybe that's why this is happening to me. These are very, 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 very tough lessons. And authenticity demands that you experience it completely. You can't just paste. If you're emotional at all, I'm never going to speak to you again. No, no, no. That's just taking some theoretical idea and pasting on it. You have to be practical in your idealism. I believe in the justice of karma. I believe that everything happens for the best. And excuse me now, I think I'll cry for 2 hours. And then after that, I'll believe in the justice of karma. It's just necessary. Does that make sense? There's one part of that, especially when we're talking about parents and children. I had a friend, she used to do affirmations for her son. She was a single mother. And she would literally affirm, in her meditation, she would visualize her son, and then she would affirm certain attitudes and qualities in him. When he reached his early teens, he began really to fight against her all the time. He was angry with her all the time. He always felt like she was pushing on him and trying to make him do things, and she didn't think she was, but he certainly thought she was. And one day the inspiration came to her that he felt her affirmations. He felt her pushing him towards certain ways of being. And it didn't make any difference whether those ways of being were valid or not. She was using her willpower to push against, to impose upon him a certain way of being. So she gave up that practice, and her prayer became, he's been my child for a short time, Divine Mother, but he's been your child for eternity. I turn his care over to you. She said almost immediately he stopped fighting her because he could feel it. You can't cheat on these things. So even with prayer, you have to be careful that you're not just trying to impose your will by getting God to do it for you. It has to be a real surrender to the truth of it. But yet then, yes, it's very helpful. Just one more small point about prayer, though, that is important. Sometimes even the feeling of the need to pray, and I know this isn't what you're saying, Larry, this is an extension of that. Sometimes the feeling of the need to pray is still attempting to hold control. And if there's negativity from that person, sometimes praying for them keeps you linked. And so sometimes what you have to do is you have to say to God and gurus or to Divine Mother, I'm going to take my mind off of this completely. But that's not because I'm not willing. It's just because right now I don't think anything is appropriate. Well, you just don't know what karma is being worked out here, do you? You can. I mean, I know this is not, I don't always recommend this, but I have myself asked certain psychic friends, tell me about this relationship. And sometimes I've got, not always, and it depends on who you ask, but sometimes I have gotten interesting answers that the way I put it is, if they're not true, they're apocryphal. And if it's apocryphal, it'll tell you what the actual interplay is and give me an insight into what this person might be working with. Or I don't go to a psychic, I just imagine it. There's a few complicated relationships in my life in which I have now essentially made up a scenario that works. And once I can get a template that fits, it may be just a fairy tale, but it explains what's happening and helps me know what is and isn't helpful. It gets me into responding and not reacting. You have to do that intelligently. But if you can actually get insight by saying, if this were true, then it's only natural that this action brings this continuous response, and that the only thing to do is this, whatever it might be. That story about my being abandoned at the railroad station when I was 9 was offered to me by a psychic woman. Yeah, I guess there was an age. I was 9. I really don't know if it's true, but it fits a lot of things in my life. And a lot of times I'm responding to situations and I actually can tie it to that story. Whether or not it's true or not, it works because it resonates. So sometimes, meditate deeply and ask for a picture. Or if there's someone you trust, you can ask them. And don't take their word blindly. But in something as complicated as this is where prayer comes in the most. By not suppressing your emotional responses, but not over-respecting them either. I consider my emotional responses to be like a hole in the hose where the water just comes shooting out, and it just takes a while to get mastery of it and close it down again. That I don't really want there to be holes in the hose where the water's squirting out in all directions. But if there is one there, I can't just tell it to go away. It's there. So sometimes emotion just has to play itself out. But there's always some part of me that is waiting for it to be over rather than elevating it to the level of a god. I know that I'm reacting and I'm upset, and karma is always fair, and the truth of my nature is bliss, and now I've lost touch with it, and we will travel through this tumultuous country But when we get to the end of it, then we will stop and we will think about what to do next. And that's what Master calls, you can't always overcome your tests, but at least you can resist them a little bit. And that's not suppressing, that's just not buying into it 100%. And then you pull yourself together, you objectively, as well as you can, between objective and intuitive, decide what is appropriate attitude and action, and then you follow it until you fall apart again. And in between, you cultivate through unrelated means as much reality to your relationship with God and Guru as you possibly can. And you keep reminding Divine Mother that you're doing your best and a little help would be really welcome. And there is a point at which grace will release you. But the way they put it is you've pounded a nail into a piece of wood, which is to say you've set karmic forces in motion and you really don't know how long the nail is. So by having the right attitude, you're trying to remove the nail, but you don't know if you're going to have to pull on it for this whole incarnation, or if you have 1/8 of an inch left and one more tug is going to pull it out. But if you mentally resist, accept whatever chaos is part of your life, but don't worship it and don't allow it to rule you, and consistently come back to center whenever you can, and cultivate by every other means. When I said to Swamiji about, I can't take this relationship any further, he said, well, you grow in other ways, and then you'll come back to it. So rather than just pounding on this, observe what it is that's lacking in yourself that causes this to be such an issue. And then you begin to cultivate strength in those ways, whether it's meditation or spiritual practice or artistic endeavor or more discipline in other areas, whether it's right diet, more exercise, whatever it is that will develop you in the ways that are clearly lacking here, you just develop it as an unrelated skill. But what happens is that when you circle back, you're somebody else. But if you can't do anything about it, don't keep pounding on it, but make yourself capable of doing something about it. And if you keep all that up, karma ends. That's all that happens. At a certain point, karma's over, and all of a sudden the nail pops out, and when it happens, it's a miracle. And it seems absolutely unrelated to anything else you did. But somehow it isn't. I can't answer it better than that. That's how I've experienced it. Well, that's the word appropriate. And appropriate is expansive and contractive, and what is best for everyone, including me. Everyone is equal in the eyes of God. This is a tricky business. Even a murderer is loved by God the same as a saint. And God rejoices when anyone in every jiva moves from contractiveness toward expansiveness. And if that means only to kill the person that you dislike the most and not everybody else who's in the room, wow, that's a big step forward for you, right? Or if it's to, meditate all day and be utterly selfless, oh, that's a big step forward for you. And the mother rejoices that everybody is growing. Now, just a second, I lost. The thought was, what's appropriate? So I are no less important to God than my children, my husband, my coworkers, but nor am I more important. I'm just one of the factors in the story. And so I have to evaluate it as to what's appropriate. And part of what's appropriate is quite simply what I can handle. And my feelings are also part of the story. And it may be that it would be nice if I could keep being generous to you, but you know what? I'm at the end of my tolerance. And if I'm at the end of my tolerance, that's part of the story. And you are just going to have to put up with it because I'm not less or more important than you, but I'm also important. And when you're completely calm and centered, then you can really evaluate it very objectively. So yeah, it's a question, especially between parents and their children. At what point do I just say to my self-centered, inconsiderate, impossible offspring, you know what? I'm disowning you. I've just had it with you. Or with any relationship. I've just had it with you. And maybe there's a more noble response than this one, but I'm not capable of making it. And so here we are. This is reality. This is where you have to be practical in your idealism. That ideally I would have the capacity to accept more than I am, but I don't. I just have to get away from you. And good luck, but I'm gone. And it's, I'm not generous, I'm not proud of it, but that's what's happening. It's appropriate, because if I stay here, it's going to get worse. That's why nice is not the criteria. And, you just reach a point where you're just dying on the vine. Circumstances, people, just no more good can come from this. It's bad and it's going to get worse. And of the choices in front of me, this is the one I'm taking. Well, sometimes you are running away from karma. How you find out is you meet it again. Sometimes, you see, the fear of making a mistake is the actual contractive decision you're making. Do you see? It's not always so obvious what is contractive and what is expansive. Fear of making a mistake is a very contractive position, because then you're absolutely paralyzed. You do nothing. So sometimes you have to say, well, maybe I'm making a mistake, but at least I'm moving energy, and it's more expansive to do something foolish than it is to do nothing at all because I'm so afraid. So it's nice to cultivate people whose objective wisdom you can trust and have them help you, because you don't always know. But the other thing you have to realize, it doesn't make any difference. If you make a mistake, you can turn it into a positive just by learning from it. That's why I was saying we all think that the details are the issue. It's not. It's in a couple of Sundays ago, maybe even last Sunday, when I was speaking here in church, the subject was spiritual tests. And to my own surprise, I picked it up from a very interesting angle, which is not really how to deal with tests, but what do you do after you fail them? Because that's really the most important question, because we will all fail continuously. We will react and run away in one way or another. And then when we realize that we've made a mess of things, what do we do then? And what we do is we say, wow, that didn't work. Here I am in exactly the same trouble, so let me try again. Because that's what really determines our success or failure. And being too afraid to move for fear of making a mistake is really much worse than making mistakes. Because then at least energy is moving. You're learning things. Stuff is happening. That's how many times you get up. If you're just paralyzed, you're neither falling nor moving. You're just standing there. That's why Swami always said he much preferred an energetic, difficult person than someone, as he put in a different context, was too afraid, didn't have enough energy to sin. That was the word he used. They're pious because they don't have enough energy to sin, not because they're really good. Linda, we never really talked much about your situation, about feeling beyond yourself, where you're working, but we've touched it in a lot of other ways. Yeah, as long as you're trying to be expansive, the results will take care of themselves, because your consciousness will be where it needs to be. And what difference does it make? If you look at people, the people who are unafraid are the ones who are the most competent, not the people who are competent. If you understand what I mean? Not the talent is less an indicator of your capability than fearlessness. Because if you're not afraid, you can keep learning. And if you're not afraid, you try, you ask, you expose yourself, you cooperate. I had to learn that. I thought to be competent was to be able to do it. So whenever I didn't feel competent, I just froze and hid my incompetence. And then I realized that all the really capable people around me were always saying, I don't know how to do this. Can you help me? And I suddenly saw that it was their fearlessness and their willingness just to be what they were that actually made them extremely effective, much more effective than me, because I was always contracted in my fear. And so it became just to not be afraid was the expansive action, not to be right, to get it right, to do it right. I always thought to be expansive, I had to do it right. No, I just had to be not afraid and do it anyway. Fear, as they say, is not the absence of Courage is not the absence of fear. It's just the willingness to go forward anyway. But often what we're protecting is our own self-image and our own very false idea of what competency looks like. I mean, you all work in the world, you know that much more than I. And yes, I know sometimes you're with really terrible people who exploit your courage, but that's why you have to make your criteria inward and go back to where there is dharma, there is victory. If I'm doing the right thing, it will work out eventually. There's a metaphysical law. God will never send you a test greater than you can handle. Mother Teresa of Calcutta's response to that was, sometimes I wish God didn't have such a high opinion of me. But that's where karma is always fair. And, you know, those are the things you can weep about. I think this is too big for me, Lord. I really, really, really do. But in the end, thy will, not mine, be done. And it doesn't matter how long it takes you to get there and how many times you fall from that, as long as when all the dust settles, you come back.